This is a video to explore reliability in research methods. So, when we think about reliability, we have to think about it with validity. The first thing that you need to know is that reliability means consistency. How consistent something is. For AQA, if you're answering a question on reliability, you must use the word consistency. So if we take an IQ test, if we wrapped a tape measure around someone's head, would this be a reliable measure? Would it be a valid measure? It would be reliable if every time we put the tape measure around somebody's head, we got the same measurement. This would therefore be a reliable measure, but it wouldn't be a valid measure. It wouldn't be testing what it intended to. It would simply be testing the size of someone's head. It would not be testing intelligence. So when we look at reliability and validity, we need to consider that there is actually a large difference between the two. So reliability is, can you repeat it and get the same measurement? And validity is it measuring what it intends to measure? When we want to design a study, we need to look at issues of both reliability and validity. If it's not reliable and valid, it's very difficult to draw conclusions from it. Reliability is concerned with the consistency of data. Remember and use the word consistency. So in other words, do we get the same results time after time? So when you're considering a question with reliability, look at whether you can repeat it. Have a look at the measuring tool. What is being used to measure? Is it a tape measure? Is it a speedometer? Is it a metronome? What is it that's being used to measure? And this is where you will find your issue with reliability. Validity is concerned with the truthfulness of data. So does it measure what it intends to measure? So if you're ever struggling, think back to the example that I've just shown you about the measuring tape. It might be reliable to put a measuring tape around someone's head, but it's not valid. Students often find it difficult to differentiate between reliability and validity. And sometimes it becomes complicated when tests can be reliable but not valid, such as the measuring tape, but a test cannot be valid and not reliable. So we're going to focus on reliability. There are two types of reliability: external, outside of the study, and internal. If you're struggling between this, just think of it as one type. And an easy way to look at it would be to look at external validity between tests. So do we get the same results time after time doing the same test or doing the same investigation? If we go back to the measuring tape around someone's head, if we measure a tape around their head at 10 a.m. and at 12 p.m. and at 2 p.m, we would get the same measurement. Therefore, this would be seen to be reliable. Internal reliability is harder. This is where you look at the results within a test. Are the results consistent? If we split the test in half, do both halves show the same thing? So if you take a spelling test and there are 20 questions, are all 20 questions of similar difficulty? To find this out, you would split the test into two, perhaps looking at all the odd questions and then all the even. Remember, this is about, do you get the same results? So, the two things that we have to look at are improving reliability and checking reliability. For reliability, these are usually the same. It's with validity where it's different. So reliability can always be improved by greater accuracy of measurement. This can be through a pilot study. So if you're asked a question, how could the reliability be improved? You could say, I would conduct a pilot study first, which is a pre-study to check that the measurements work. This would be a basic answer. Another answer would be to say, I would take more than one measurement. If 2 or more measurements were all the same, then I could say that this was reliable. I could standardize my measurement. I could get several people to measure it. I could then compare them. If you have an observation, reliability can be improved by checking the effectiveness of the observation categories. Many students struggle with this, firstly because they fail to recognise that a study is an observation, but secondly, that they forget that an observation is only as good as the categories. Are the categories reliable? And think about it as if 2 or 3 people were to carry out the observation, would they be able to understand and measure the categories exactly the same? So for example, if you're looking at aggression in a playground and you use one of the categories as smacking, would everybody mark down a smack for the same movement? And you would do this, you would improve this by getting 2 or more raters to look at this and explain, and if they got the same result, this would be considered to be reliable. So, explain the following ways of assessing reliability. The first is the Test-Retest method. So, the Test-Retest method would be where you do the test once and then a week later you do the test again. If you get the same results, this would be considered reliable. You cannot do this with an observation. You cannot do this with categories. The split half method I mentioned earlier with a spelling test. This is where you look at a test and you actually split it into 2. If both halves are the same, you could then conclude that this was reliable. Standardization. Is everybody doing the same thing? Are all the people who are measuring and asking questions asking them in the same way? Are the tests being conducted in the same way? Interrater and inter-interviewer reliability are very similar. Interrater reliability refers to observations and is whether 2 or more raters or observers view categories in the same way and measure them in the same way. Inter-interviewer reliability is where 2 or more interviewers would interpret the results of an interview in the same way. These are the only ways that AQA require you to know for assessing reliability. Please do not get these mixed up with validity. So, how else can we physically do this? How else could we assess the reliability of a lab experiment? Well, this is quite difficult because we don't necessarily have a set of questions and we don't have categories. So what we would do in this case is ensure that all controls were tightened and all procedures were standardised. So for example, everybody carried out the experiment in exactly the same way. How could we assess the reliability of an observation? This would be inter-rater reliability. Check if it's an observation. Look for categories. Look at the measuring tool and the way that something has been measured. Check that the observers are in line with each other. This is known as inter-rater reliability. And to do this, you would train the observers to ensure that they were in line with each other. This is very similar for assessing the reliability of an interview. Check that the interviewers are in line with each other, check that they are consistent, and compare the answers. Researchers investigated chimps and their ability to acquire language. The chimps were videotaped during a task and were learning to acquire language. A researcher recorded lifetime data while they were being videoed. A different observer then played back the video to score the data. Identify possible issues with reliability. Well, first of all, my issue would be with different observers. So straight away, the issue is with Interrater reliability. How could the reliability of this be assessed? You would compare two raters to see if they both marked down the same behaviours for acquiring language. If they were in line with each other, you would say that this was reliable. You could carry out a correlation between the two observers. The closer it is to 1, we can say it's a positive correlation between two observers and therefore is considered reliable. How could we improve it? We could tighten up the categories. We could ensure that the categories were easier to measure. Here's another scenario. This relates to questionnaires, and therefore we would potentially be looking at interviewer reliability, or we could be looking at the split half method, because we're dealing with something where we could split the questionnaire into 2, and we could look at questions to ensure that they were all measuring the same thing. This ends the session on reliability.